Okay, we're going to take a look at our kick and bass, our low end layers. Essentially, this builds the foundation of the track, so we really need to make sure we get it nice and tight and glued together and thick and warm sounding. This will basically set the tone of the track and will also make sure that when played over a loud sound system in a club or also at home, that we're able to feel the track rather than just hear it with our ears. So this is a very, very important layer to get right. There are so many different ways of creating an interesting and nice sounding low end. What I often like to do is combine a short, punchy kick with a nice transient on the beat, and then complement that with multiple sub layers, in this case from 3 different sources. I've got this sub sample, I've got a bass drum sample with a bit of a kind of sub tail that I've cut out, and then I'm also using this sine wave sub generator, this rack that I recently got, which was sounding nice, and all together just with kind of processing and smart side chaining and ducking out and obviously a lot of testing and reiterating. I came up with a layer that is sounding like this all together. So as you can hear, we've got a nice punchy kick on beat, on the downbeat, and then after the kick, the different layers of subs are playing in a kind of groovy, somewhat rhythmic pattern already. So even with just the kick and bass, only a short part of the frequency spectrum, we've already got a bit of movement and a bit of a groove, which will also make adding further percussive elements and later our synth writing, etc., a lot more easy because we're able to already feel where the gaps are, what the kind of flow is of the track. And yeah, having a bit of groove in the low end can really help bring in an interesting dynamic and keep things sounding interesting and less robotic and predictable. So let us start with the kick drum up here. What I used here was a kick drum I like to use. It's my own sample that I created from my Nocta track. This is consisting of 2 kick drum samples that I layered and processed and exported, and it sounds just really nice, really punchy, nice and thick, a good transient, and then a nice kind of mid quality to it that is just nice for setting the grid and creating a bit of punch. So as you can hear, really nice and short, as we want to leave a lot of space for the sub layers. Essentially what I've done here in terms of processing is just added a compressor for a bit of volume control here. Then I've carved out frequencies around 550, boosted the low end a little bit here, kept the mid and highs fairly flat. I did add some overdrive here in the mid high just to add a bit of crunch and a bit of kind of gnarly sound qualities on this side of the spectrum. Then a drum bus, which is a really great Ableton stock tool for just adding drive, adding a bit of more warmth and a bit more heat to your kick, and then a utility just to control the mono and stereo with this button. So yeah, fairly basic processing, but to be honest, if you're working with great samples and you've got things complementing each other really nicely, then you don't need to go over the top. And also I like to keep things fairly clean and straightforward when it comes to my low ends, simply because we'll get really busy with all the different sound effects and variations and automation when it comes to other elements. So this needs to be kind of just straight and fat and thick and cohesive sounding when all played together. I will move on to sub 1. This is just a sub sample that I found. I'll often just go into my library, I'll search for sub, as I've done here, and then have a click through. Obviously you've always got your go-tos that you can always fall back onto. So obviously some really nice kind of sine wavy blaring subs there that yeah, would probably also be workable and something we could transform into a cool rhythmic sub. In this case I went for the kick sub wall. Just liking the qualities of that sound. It's got this kind of thick, pushy low end to it, a bit almost kind of like a growl. So what I did here is essentially just adjust the volume a little bit. Then I carved out the mid and highs, as we don't really need those in the low end. We kind of want to stay in this area. I did add a bit of a dip here, starting around 20, as we also don't really need information on this side. It will kind of just lead to a kind of muddy and difficult low end, as this is not really audible to us, so it doesn't really make sense to fill up the track with information in the very, very lows, as in most cases we won't be experiencing these frequencies anyway. So it's better just clear up the mix, clear up the EQ and cut these out, but definitely want to preserve the frequencies here, kind of between 30 and 100 with a bit of a slope thereafter. Then adding a bit of overdrive just to drive some more warmth into it, kind of expand it a little bit. Same reason on the drum bus, add a bit more drive to the whole sound. But then I've got this awesome tape compressor, the J37, as this really nice harmonic analog kind of warmth to the sub. Then put everything in mono again. Then I've got a compressor making the sub duck to our kick, in this case audio from the Ghost, which I explained earlier. Then this was just used for a bit of volume adjustment. We can actually get rid of this one, just add a bit of dB here. And obviously we'll be tweaking all of this in the mix down. So this is just to get it sounding already pretty nice. I do like to do a bit of sound design, which you can see as I go along, as otherwise things would just get way too messy and I wouldn't hear what is working, what is not working, what do we still need to adjust, what do we still need to add, which elements. So I do like to just have everything working quite nicely together while building it initially already. And then here at the end of the chain, again, just cutting out any kind of over 130 hertz, because we don't need any mids and highs in the low end once again. So just another Q cut here to make sure that there was nothing in the mid or highs coming from this processing, just to clean it up in the end. Moving on to the second sub. So this is a bit of a denser groove with a bit more movement in the rhythm. And what I did here is cut out the sub tail from a bass drum that I like the sound of. Again, very similar processing, cut out the mids and highs, added some overdrive and a drum bus for extra warmth, pushing the sound a little bit. Again, this tape compressor to give it that analog warmth, and mono utility here. Again, sidechain to the Ghost to make it duck for the kick drum, to not compensate any of the kick drum. And then I've got this ducking to the first sub actually. So I decided this is the kind of master sub, this is the slave sub, so to speak. This will duck away for the sub one. A bit of makeup gain here to compensate the ducking. And then again, an EQ cut here to get rid of any unwanted mids and highs. Then finally, the last sub. So this is a kind of long, elongated sub sound. I generated it with this pretty interesting rack that I got recently. I'll just show you what the tweaking looks like here. So some pretty awesome capabilities where, just with the turn of a knob, you can kind of mess around and experiment, find something you're looking for to complement the other elements here. All together, this is sounding pretty nice, but I'll just show you quickly how I processed this one before we listen to everything again. So yeah, I got it ducking to the kick drum, of course, here with the side chain. A drum bus I also added just to drive everything up again, add some more warmth. EQ'd at this point, in this case focusing a bit more around the kind of 130 frequency range, so actually clearing this up for the other subs, and again cutting away mids and highs. Then I've got two side chains here. The first one is ducking to sub 1 and the second one to sub 2. So this is supposed to be generally adding warmth and flow kind of sub layer. I do not want it to be the lead sub, which is why in this case I've put it in terms of hierarchy under the first two subs. So all together they have this nice kind of roll, and obviously this took some experimentation, seeing okay, what kind of pattern is nice, how do they vibe together ideally, and how do they then work with the kick. But yeah, this is what they sound like. So you can hear different parts of this frequency are being covered here. Now obviously we're in the low end section, but even in that low end you can hear there's a bit of movement, different parts of the spectrum. They're not all just going for the same slim band of low end, but they're actually covering a nice range, and they've got a nice groove, and it's sounding tight and a bit gnarly and a bit imperfect in a way, which I really like. There's even a bit of noise in there, which I really like. It just adds nice color and will create a nice foundation. And together with this short punchy kick, which really isn't adding all too much bass, it's just that initial attack, that initial mid or low mid punch, but together with these gnarly long subby elements, it's really coming together nicely, and I think creating a nice foundational layer to work with. Okay, so that was the individual processing. Now, how did I set up these groups? So these groups are set up in a kind of tactical way. I wanted to first process the subs on their own. So what I did here is add a bit of an EQ. Now, I would also, just as a side note, often use the FabFilter Q3, but what I do like about this EQ is that it's just visible on site, and because we use EQs so much in our production workflow generally, oftentimes also just like having the EQ8 as it's right there, it's easy to work with, you can quickly adjust. There's so many EQs that are going to be all over the track. So sometimes instead of clicking open a new window, I do like to have it just right here for quick adjusting and also visibility. Basically just carved out these kind of around 550 frequencies, as this can create some mud, which is unwanted, just boosted around the 25 zone just to pronounce those kind of sub layers a bit more. Yeah, don't need much in the mid highs. There is a bit of noise and a bit of gnarliness that I do want to keep to a certain level though. Then this delay I had, sometimes it can be also fun to just see, okay, how would these subs sound delayed? How would they work with the kick delayed? Sometimes it can create an even better pattern, even better rhythm. So very, very valuable to just have this delay on a lot of elements, have the dry wet on 100 and see what would it sound like. In this case, it wasn't so great, but it's worth testing out. And then I have everything ducking to the kick, to the ghost once again, here with a decent amount of ducking. Attack and release, fairly short here, so that essentially it reacts quickly to the signal coming from the kick, and then it doesn't release for ages, but it also releases in a fairly short amount of time so that it stays punchy and dynamic and doesn't kind of collide with the kick, and just kind of a shorter movement, a more quick movement, which is what we are needing for this kind of more rhythmic, interactive pattern. So that's the processing of the subgroup. And then once again, a utility for the mono setting. Right, what did we do here on the kick and subgroup? So this is where the Saturn tape machine comes into play. This is a setting I put together and I've been using quite a bit for gluing together my kick and sub. What this tape machine does is it processes the kick and sub in a way that it really ties everything together, makes it really tight, adds again this kind of analog touch, which you can also determine here how much of that you want. But it's really worth playing around with all the different parameters and finding a sound that works for your style of kick and sub. This makes everything really nice and punchy and cohesive. And yeah, generally I'm a big fan of the Satin. It really does great things, especially in the low end. This is what I often have to tie together kick and low end layers. Then again, after that processing, again, wanting to remove anything around 550 to avoid mud, and then putting everything in mono, and then all together as it sounds, yeah, really tight, nice and glued together with a good thickness while not sounding too fat and too overbearing. Also, as I said, that movement, that dynamic is going to be really helpful later on when finding the next kind of patterns and the next call and response elements you might want to integrate. Even in the next chapter, I think we'll be making use of this kind of sub-rhythm and complementing it with some interesting percussion elements and hats and a clap, and it should come together fairly quickly. I think this is a great foundation already. It's very simple. It's not super fancy processing, but honestly, when you have good sounds and good sounds that are working very well together, and you find a good pattern, and you do good side chaining, and you do a nice amount of saturation and processing, even simple elements can come together in a really nice way. So yeah, this is how I often like to process my kick and lows, often with multiple layers in the sub area, just to have a bit of movement and a bit of variation and cover the spectrum in an interesting way. And then a short punchy kick will oftentimes also be a 909 or some sort of pre-processed 909, and just taking the nice punchy attack for a nice kind of downbeat kick, and all together creating an interesting and already somewhat moving groove.